This is the most useful tool in carpentry and also the most dangerous. In my Just 2 Power Tools video, I discussed why I thought the circular saw was the most important saw a DIYer could own. But I've always been nervous to recommend this tool to carpentry newcomers because it's so powerful and there are so many ways to mishandle it. I'm going to do a lot of videos about the circular saw in the future, but right now I want to start off by discussing the 11 worst mistakes you can make and how to avoid them. That's coming up next on the Honest Carpenter Show. I'll mention real quick that I picked up a fresh circular saw for this video. It's a corded Makita, which I think is the best circular saw on the market. Makita did not send this to me. I bought this. I've always bought Makitas. It's all I've used since I was little because they're just the best all-around saw. I'll link some below in the description if you're looking for one. This model is just over $100 or over about $160 if you want the carrying case, which I still think is a great deal for such a quality tool. You can easily use this saw for 20 plus years if you just take care of it. That said, let's get on with our list, and we'll start off with the worst of the worst. Mistake number 1, getting in the cut path. A circular saw is basically like a freehand table saw. They have 13 to 15 amp motors, which spin a 7¼ inch blade at upwards of 5,000 RPMs. That is a lot of cutting power. A 12-inch miter saw has a similar yield with a bigger blade and fewer RPMs. So you get the same power in this little handheld saw as you do in that big bench-mounted saw. But the difference between the shop saws and this smaller one is that the circular saw has no fixed path. The only thing keeping your circular saw in line is your hand and your wrist and your arm, so it's capable of taking these huge lurches. The first mistake is putting any part of your body in its cut path. This includes putting your free hand in front of or behind the saw. Don't do that. Also, don't put your knee, leg, or foot behind the saw or in front of it. Always stand just to the side of the cut path when you're using the saw. And whenever possible, keep both hands on the saw. And don't reach beneath your piece when you're cutting. This could put your fingers in the cut path from below. Instead, use clamps to hold your piece steady and get your free hand out of the way. This is so important because it has a lot to do with mistake number 2, binding the blade. Blade binding occurs when a spinning blade receives too much pressure from the wood it's cutting through. I talked about this a lot in my most important word in carpentry video. Watch that video, it's the crux of everything we do when we're cutting. But in short, when the saw cuts a path, the blade sits in the channel it has cleared. This channel is known as the kerf. The kerf is a safe bubble for the blade to spin in. It keeps the blade free of contact with the walls of the cut. However, if you twist the saw while cutting, pressure will build against the blade. This pressure will cause the saw to kick and jump backwards out of the cut. This is why you have to keep appendages out of the cut path. Kickback can cause the spinning blade to leap at you. So, don't twist the saw while you're cutting. Keep pushing it in a perfectly straight line. Also, make sure your piece is supported near the cut. This will keep the cut line from collapsing. If you don't have proper support for the piece, it will bow as the saw passes through it. The bending material will begin to squeeze the blade, once again causing it to bind and kick back. In both cases, binding is caused by too much pressure on the saw blade itself. The motor bogs down and the saw leaps out of the cut. That's how disasters occur, so avoid it. This brings us to mistake number 3, failure to prop the cut. In order for a circular saw to work, the saw blade has to extend beyond the bottom of the piece you're cutting. This causes a problem because anything below your piece is in danger of being cut. You can't just cut flat on the floor or on your work table because you'll cut through those surfaces. You need to prop up your piece to cut it. The easiest way to do this is to just put some scrap wood beneath your material. You can space it so that your blade avoids the scrap blocks, but the saw is still firmly supported. Or you can place the blocks in the cut path and just let your blade pass through them. That's really the easiest way. You avoid some of the problems that spacing blocks underneath can cause, like unintentional binding when you space them too far apart. For some cuts, I even sometimes just hang the waste end off of my work table and make the cut like that. Gravity pulls the waste piece down, naturally preventing some binding. But this is trickier to do and it gets dangerous if your waste end is too long, which creates a cantilever. If you need to cut near the center of a piece, you're better off propping it up. Make sure you have the most support directly beneath the weight of the saw and that the material isn't bowing inwards. I often space blocks about 2 inches to either side of the cut path. Then I have extra blocks to support the far ends of the material. Nothing is likely to move or jostle this way. Mistake number 4, setting the saw blade too deep. As I said, the blade has to extend through the full depth of the piece you're cutting, but it doesn't have to extend too far. You should have less than 1/4 inch of exposed saw blade hanging below your material. More than this causes instability because it creates more blade surface that can bind up. Anything beyond 1/4 inch isn't helping. It's just increasing the chances of kickback while you're cutting. Also, keeping it at 1/4 inch guarantees that you aren't cutting too deeply into your prop blocks. This would just bog the saw down unnecessarily. And on that note, mistake number 5, adjusting the saw while it's in motion. To change your blade depth, you often just release a lever and swivel your saw plate up or down. I shouldn't have to say this, but don't do this while the saw is spinning. I see DIYers trying to make plunge cuts like this all the time, but I think that's a bad idea. The moving components are meant to stay locked during operation. That includes the bevel feature and depth set. Also, mistake number 6, don't retract a spinning blade. This is when you finish a partial cut and then yank the saw out while the blade is still in motion. You see this on job sites all the time, and I'll admit that I've done it more times than I can count. Pro carpenters are just always in a rush and we come to overly trust our skills, but DIYers don't need to do this. Instead, wait a few seconds for the saw to spin down, then retract it. This will prevent binding that happens if you twist the saw on the way out. That would cause a really weird kickback. Also, you can easily screw up a good cut this way when the saw nicks the material. Keep those lines neat. Let the saw spin down, then pull it. Mistake number 7, removing the blade guard. Here's another completely ridiculous thing that I see on job sites, and something that I personally never do. Pro framers will often pin back their blade guards to keep them out of the way for fast cutting. Or they might remove them completely. Don't do this. They shouldn't be doing this, you definitely don't want to. The blade guard is there to prevent the spinning blade from contacting anything. It springs back the moment the cut is finished. Obviously, without the guard, the blade is more likely to cut you. But just as bad, if it lands blade down while it's spinning, it's going to run away like the Roadrunner. I've heard of job site nightmare stories where runaway circular saws have cut off people's fingers and toes. Not worth it. Keep your blade guard on and make sure it works. If your guard stops working, it's time to retire the saw or at least install a new spring. Likewise, mistake number 8, don't set a saw blade down. This one is a little more of a gray area. You're never supposed to set a saw blade down just in case the guard didn't spring back. If it didn't spring back, it might go running. So instead, you're supposed to flip them over like turtles. I know this is good common sense, but it is hard to commit to sometimes when you're working. Doing this just makes them harder to grab because the handle is then upside down. If I'm not in the position to do it this way, I have some other options. The first and most important thing is that I check the blade guard before I put it down. I look at it after every cut to make sure that it's sprung back. This is just a good habit to get into. And I wait for the saw to spin down before setting it somewhere. It can't cause harm if it's not spinning. Another thing I do, seriously, is set it down in the open carrying case whenever I can. Other carpenters are probably going to say that I'm crazy for doing this, but I've always seen it as a great option. The case has a gully for the blade to sit in, so it's shaped perfectly. It's also soft, and it won't scuff the sole plate like concrete will. Never put a saw on concrete. It'll scratch everything it cuts afterwards. And since I tend to do my cutting in one place for a while, my case is typically right there beside my cut table. I just reach down and put the saw in it. If the case isn't there, I will sometimes set the saw on my lumber so that the blade hangs down over the edge. But this can be unstable, so I can't necessarily recommend it. Whatever you do, your best bet is to check the blade guard after every usage, let the saw wind down, then put it down. Safety first. Mistake number 9, starting up with contact. You should never spin up the saw when the blade is already in contact with wood. A lot of people try to do this when they're finishing off a cut. They make a partial curve in a board, then they have to change position to keep going. But when you're preparing to start up again, make sure you pull the saw back just a little bit so it's no longer touching wood at the front of the blade. Now you can start up your cut without contact. When the saw is spinning at full speed, gently continue the cut. Starting up with contact can cause the saw to buck up, which is how accidents happen. It can also damage the wood you're cutting or the saw itself because it has to start spinning with a lot of stress. The saw blade should spin up free of contact, then cuts can be made. Mistake number 10, cord drag. As you make a longer cut, like a rip, the cord on many saws can get hung up on the end of the board. It'll slide with you for a while, then suddenly it'll catch and stop the saw from moving. If it pulls too hard, it can twist the blade, and once again this causes binding and kickback. As you're making your longer cuts, consider holding the cord in your free hand for a while until you can safely hang it off to the side. Make sure it doesn't trail and catch on the end of the board. You can also cause this problem by stepping on your own cord. So before I make every cut, I consider where the cord is and where it's going to wind up. I take care of that before I start cutting. Cord control is a big part of saw safety. And mistake number 11, forgetting trigger discipline. Just like when you're handling a loaded gun, you don't ever really want your finger on the trigger until you're ready to pull it. When you're carrying a saw around between cuts, keep your finger off the trigger. Just carry the saw with the rest of your hand, 3 fingers and your thumb. Grab the pommel with your free hand if you need extra support. Just don't use that index finger. After you've made your initial lineups, you can go ahead and put your finger in the guard, pull the trigger, and let the saw spin up. When the cut is finished, release the trigger and take your finger right back out of the guard. Keep it this way until you set the saw down or get ready to start another cut. It sounds obvious, but a lot of DIYers fire up saws on accident when, as I mentioned, they step on their own cords. The saw yanks down and they squeeze the trigger. This is easily fixed by just keeping your finger out of the trigger guard. So that's it, 11 circular saw mistakes and how to avoid them. As I said, I'm going to be doing a lot more circular saw videos in the future because they're so useful, but they're also dangerous. Always use extreme caution when you're working with circular saws. Don't use them for the first time without supervision and never handle them recklessly. In the end, you're entirely responsible for your own safety. That said, what did you think of the video? Was it helpful? Would you include anything I didn't mention? Please, let me hear about it down in the comments. Also, I'm going to link several circular saws down in the description. Makita is my favorite, but I'm going to link several other popular brands as well. Feel free to browse them, and remember that when you shop through these links, we receive a small commission at no extra charge to you. It helps us keep making videos, and we greatly appreciate the support. As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to check back in for more videos coming up soon, and please consider subscribing and hitting that little bell button to turn on notifications. That way you'll know the moment we post something. I'm Ethan James with TheHonestCarpenter.com. I'll see you next time.